Welcome back to the Universalis podcast. I am Martin Kochański, the creator of Universalis, and in this episode I'll be looking at the highlights of the week ahead, starting with Sunday the 13th of October. Another week and another Tuesday on which we have a feast of a Carmelite Saint Teresa. On the 1st it was Thérèse of Lisieux, on the 15th it is Teresa of Ávila. In the course of 2 weeks we have gone back more than 300 years, from a famous discalced Carmelite to the founder of the order. Teresa was born in Ávila in 1515. She entered the Carmelite convent there at the age of 20. In her autobiography she is careful to tell us that she had no particular vocation to be a nun. She was not so much going into the convent as she was going out of the world. When she then talks passionately, but very discreetly, about the corruption of the world and the dangers of bad company, one's first instinct is to think how old-fashioned it all sounds. Why not chill and be a little tolerant? Of course, we're defending ourselves, really, against a challenge we ought to be facing and mostly don't. Particularly when you are in your late teens, as Teresa was, you are dazzled by the glamour and sophistication of the adult world which is all around you and ever so slightly above you. You despise your own innocence. You do your best to seem at least as sophisticated as your friends. You show yourself broad-minded enough to admire vice as long as it is done with dash and flair. It is only years later that you realize how foul all that sin was you were flirting with. Perhaps that moment comes when you catch up with the very people who paraded those vices so glitteringly back then and are now glued up with them for evermore. The indications are that Teresa was at least as good at sophisticated social interaction as all her friends were, but that she had a sense of smell well in advance of her years. She could smell the evil at the same time as she was playing around with the edges of it. There is no reason at all to doubt her judgment that she had to separate herself from the world before it consumed her. Now, at first sight it might seem that charging off into a convent is rather an extreme reaction to the evils of the world. But in Teresa's time, convents were not what they had been. The Carmelites had originated as a band of hermits on Mount Carmel. Transplanted to Europe, they had taken up a conventual life of exceptional severity. But time had mitigated the penances of the first Carmelites. Each little step in making life easier was sensible in its own way. For instance, constant fasting may be an admirable penance, but if it means that when you pray you can't think of God, only of how hungry you are, perhaps lightening the burden will be an actual spiritual benefit. By Teresa's time, a convent was a community of ladies within easy reach of a town. They were not ragged or beggars or starving or dirty or cold. They were well educated and civilized, elegant if austere, and they participated fully in the social life of the town. Visitors would come and go, they would chat and gossip. It was all quite pleasant and a good, safe environment. Really, if such an institution had not existed for unmarried women, it would have been necessary to invent it. If anyone specially wanted to be holy, God was always on tap if needed. Teresa started by being rather bad at prayer. Distractions would come charging in the moment she tried to empty her mind. The candid remarks that she makes about her difficulties with prayer would make an encouraging pamphlet for beginners. Her difficulties were mostly the same as ours. But in the end, Teresa did get somewhere. Or rather, God got her somewhere, because an important step in prayer life is to understand whose side the impetus is really coming from. Teresa received encouragement, sometimes even in the form of visions, which were a source of alarm to her just at first, and rightly so. Anyone can hallucinate. Anyone can work really, really hard on seeing things and achieve it. Purely synthetic visions, of course. Even the devil may stick his oar in now and then. The first thing any serious mystic does with visions is to distrust them deeply. The Carmelites may have been rather relaxed where their rule of life was concerned, but they did have good support structures. It is said that no one is alone on the Olympic podium. It is filled with an invisible crowd of trainers, coaches, physiotherapists, teammates and family. In the same way, no nun was alone. There were confessors, there were spiritual directors, there were various levels of people who watched over the convent from the outside for the times when it needed guidance. It was a great relief to Teresa to find her advisers considered her encounters with God to be a genuine thing, and eventually, after many years of effort, many years, she advanced in prayer, to the prayer of quiet, and then to the various kinds of contemplation. As she became a better and better contemplative, Teresa began to realize that a convent on the then Carmelite model, well integrated into the world, protected from the world's difficulties, but not protected at all from all its diversions and distractions, was about the worst possible place for serious prayer and contemplation. She longed for a stricter, more enclosed, distraction-free place, and as she learned more about the original, primitive Carmelite rule, she realized that something like that was what was needed, not just for her, but for other women who had a genuine call to prayer and contemplation. You could say, being utterly tactless about it, that Teresa saw the need for a house just like the Carmelites, only religious. The original rule was already there. All that was needed was a chance to live by it. St. Joseph had always been a particular friend to Teresa, and he had never failed to help her, so the first such convent was to be dedicated to him. A friend of hers, a widow, had some money but not very much, so it was decided that the first community could have only 12 nuns plus a prioress. If you want a convent, you do not just go off and start one. Some kind of permission is needed. This is not needless bureaucracy, it is common sense. We all know how easy it is to go overboard on a project on the first flush of enthusiasm. You decide to get fit, so you decide to lift the heaviest weights you can think of, you get injured, and that is the end of that. The rule you have thought of for your convent may sound good in theory, but if it puts 12 women plus a prioress into a house where they quickly die of pneumonia and malnutrition, that does no good for either God or man. At this point, the story becomes very, very complicated. The project had opponents, sometimes passionate ones. It had friends and supporters. Sometimes someone was a supporter but then got cold feet. Sometimes someone was hostile and it was necessary to go above his head. Now all those social skills which the world had given Teresa even as she was fleeing it came into her own, because she was able to look even the great in the eye and talk to them as one equal to another. At various times, Teresa found herself not only having to get the approval of the Pope, but also having to invoke the support of the king. Some of the opponents did make valid points. Here is one of them. Convents were expected to be self-sufficient, which meant that they were founded with an endowment sufficient for their daily needs. The original Carmelites, like all the mendicant orders, had had an ideal of absolute poverty. This would mean a community of women living not on income from investments, but on alms, on the kindness of generous people. Not, in other words, on resources guaranteed by the financial system, but guaranteed only by God. It was undoubtedly higher and holier. But was it possible? Was it sustainable? Was it even safe? At length, the convent of St. Joseph was founded in 1562 when Teresa was 47. It was a success. 16 other convents followed. 6 years later, the first community of men was founded which followed the Teresian reform. Teresa herself became an outstanding contemplative, and her writings on contemplative prayer and the various stages of it are still fundamental texts on the subject. They are the reason why she is a doctor of the Church. Opposition to the reform continued, and some of it was savage. There was nothing easy about the long journeys that Teresa undertook, or the endless, wearisome political manoeuvring that was necessary to let the convents be established. I'd like to end with my favourite story about St. Teresa, which shows that as well as elegance, determination, and good social sense, she also had a still greater gift, a sense of humour. Once, on one of her journeys through Spain, fighting opposition, founding convents, she was crossing a river when her horse stumbled and threw her into the water. When she reached the other side, freezing and dripping, she looked holily up to heaven and remarked to God, "If that is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few of them." St. Teresa's life is abundantly documented. There are books, letters, official records. For most of the saints of the first few centuries we have none of these materials. Sometimes we know nothing about them except their names. But for Monday's saint, Pope St. Callistus, we know about his life from the most reliable source possible, his bitterest enemies. If you hate someone, you cannot make him out to be as wicked as you want him to be unless you twist the facts. And you have to get those facts right before you twist them, or no one will believe you. Callistus is fortunate enough to have had a sincere and passionate enemy in the African theologian Tertullian. Tertullian tells us that Callistus started life as a slave, but then so did a great many other people. Servitude does not make you a bad person, and in the kingdom of heaven, master and slave are on a level of perfect equality. Callistus was put in charge of a bank by his master. This was absolutely normal, regular Roman practice. A slave would be assigned some money to trade with, not actually given, it was still his master's money, and pursued the trade as he thought fit, in this case lending and borrowing. The master did not know every detail of what the slave did, which in Roman law meant that the master was not liable for it. If things went wrong, only the money assigned to the slave would be lost. Things did go wrong. Callistus's bank, officially Callistus's master's bank, failed. This happens to banks. Banking is a risky business, and the failure doesn't necessarily mean that Callistus was incompetent or a thief. All the same, he fled to escape punishment. He was caught and condemned to hard labour. His creditors got him released because they thought he had the best chance of getting some of their money back for them. He tried to recover some debts from some Jews at a synagogue. There was a fight. Someone denounced Callistus as a Christian, and he was sent to be worked to death in the Sardinian quarries. Incidentally, this automatically meant that he ceased to be a slave. He would die soon, but die a free man. The emperor's mistress intervened on behalf of the condemned Christians, and they were released. Callistus was sent off to regain his broken health and given a pension by the Pope to do it on. He then disappeared from history. When he reappeared, he had somehow risen to archdeacon. He was given charge of the Roman catacomb, which is still named after him. Finally, he was elected Pope. His enemies naturally claim that this rise was a result of bullying or corruption or anything else they can think of. There is no reason to think so. What did Callistus's enemies hate about him so? Tertullian came from Africa, and one characteristic of the African theologians was their extreme black and whiteness. There was no room for shades of grey. So in particular, if you were a Christian, you were saved, and if you committed a serious sin, then you were a sinner and were damned, and that was that. This kind of issue raised itself repeatedly during the persecutions, when some people stood up to the persecutors and others gave in. But it was just as relevant to more minor sins like murder or adultery. Callistus decreed that even serious sinners could be readmitted to communion if they repented and did penance for their sin. It's worth remembering that penances in those days could be both long and heavy. Callistus maintained that this was simply an exercise of the authority given to Peter. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Tertullian had an ingenious response to this, that these words had been spoken to Peter, and this power had been given to Peter, no one else. It could not be delegated, it could not be passed on. It died with him. That was Tertullian's argument. Technically, Callistus is revered as a saint because his name appears in the Roman martyrology, even though we have no details of his martyrdom. I expect Tertullian would say he bribed someone to put him on that list. But the glorious Christian combination of, on the one hand, recognizing the seriousness of sin, and on the other hand, offering absolution for every sin, however grave, if that really originates with Callistus, as even his enemies seem to admit, then he thoroughly deserves our reverence for that fact alone. That's all for this week. If you'd like to write to us about anything, send an email to universalis@universalis.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a good week in every sense, and let's pray for one another.